Hi, everyone, and welcome to 5 Questions with Dr. Kevin McGeough. In the Faculty of Arts and Science, we know that you are all undoubtedly missing our public professor speaker series, and we are too. So we're trying to find other ways to connect with our community until we can all meet again in person. So thank you for joining us. My name is Jennifer Copeland, and I'm a professor in the Department of Kinesiology at the U of L. I'm also currently an associate dean in the Faculty of Arts and Science. Kevin and I started working at the U of L in the same year in 2003. So we've been colleagues for over 17 years. But technically, at this moment, I'm actually his boss. And I wanted to be sure to point that out to him and to all of our viewers. But joking aside, let me tell you a bit more about Dr. McGeough. Kevin McGeough is a professor of archaeology in the Department of Geography at the University of Lethbridge. And he holds a Board of Governors research chair in archaeological theory and reception. Raised in Lethbridge, Dr. McGeough holds a BA in history with great distinction from the University of Lethbridge, a master's degree from Harvard University, and a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. Kevin specializes in the archaeology, history, and languages of the ancient Near East and the reception of the ancient Near East in contemporary literature and culture. He is the author of numerous books, including a 3-volume work called The Ancient Near East in the 19th Century, and a forthcoming book on the ancient world called From Griffith to Grindhouse, Representations of Antiquity in Film. As part of our Public Professor series, back in September 2016, Kevin gave a fascinating presentation titled, I Met a Traveler from an Antique Land, The Archaeology of Progress, Decline, and Collapse. So today, I'm delighted to have a chance to catch up with Kevin and talk about his research and what he's currently working on. So here we go. Thanks for joining us. This is 5 Questions with Dr. Kevin McGeough. Thanks for joining us, Kevin. So your public professor talk was almost 4 years ago now, and the times have changed in many ways. I'm hoping you can tell us, what are you currently working on in your research program?
Hi, Jen. Sure, things have changed a lot in the past 4 years. I mean, my talk on progress, decline, and collapse is perhaps maybe a bit more frightening now than when I first gave it. But in terms of my day-to-day research, I think the biggest change for me is that right now I should be in Jordan with my students excavating an Iron Age city. And that wasn't possible this year, given the pandemic and given safety issues. So none of us are digging right now. I don't think there's very much archaeology going on at all. I think there's maybe a few projects going on by contract archaeologists that have to do some development work. But otherwise, archaeology's kind of come to a standstill right now under the pandemic. I think eventually we'll be able to pick up because you are isolated when you're on an archaeological site and you're just with the same few people, like you're in your own little bubble for a good month. But that wasn't the kind of thing we could prepare for given this how quickly everything changed. So a lot of us have been talking about how it would be in some ways great to have a year off from digging where we can publish off all the stuff that we've dug over the past 15, 20 years. But of course, the problem with that then is lab access. So we can actually get into our labs to actually work with the artifacts and see the materials. That's meant we've had to take some different kinds of approaches. So right now, one of the things I've been using this time to work on is a project my wife, Elizabeth Galway, who's a children's literature specialist, and I have been working on together on representations of archaeology in children's literature. And that's worked really well because I'm also stuck as a kindergarten teacher now, as my 5-year-old's home all day long. So I've tried to find a way to integrate my research with hanging out with her. So I've been going through all of these children's outreach materials about archaeology and kind of using her as a test subject to see what's interesting, what's not interesting, what works, what captures her interest. She's gotten really, really excited about a particular artifact called the Phaistos disc, where she's borderline obsessed with it in a creepy way, but that's something we're sort of working through as she tries to decipher that particular inscription. And it's also given me a lot of ideas though for my teaching, because I'm realizing that when I'm teaching Archie 1000 online next fall, it's a kind of course that maybe could be taught to families, not just to the one person registered. And so if people are in a situation like me where they have a child at home, archaeology is something that children are really interested in, right? So I'm gathering all these materials that I'll have alongside of my regular course presentation. I'll also be teaching stuff where people will be teaching and involving their kids in the course. And usually, when I teach Archie 1000, I have parents or I have students telling me that their parents are really interested in the topic and asking for readings and things like that. So I'm trying to sort of conceptualize my Archaeology 1000 course as something the whole family can do together and work through, and different people at different stages of their life and different kinds of engagement with the course can all be participating together. And so I think that should be a really, really fun experience. So this time working on my research and sort of thinking about relation to my teachings, I think it's going to be really, really helpful when the fall comes.
That's really interesting, Kevin. It's really interesting to think about archaeology showing up in children's literature. But as you were talking about it, it struck me that archaeology actually appears frequently throughout popular culture. And this is something that you talked about in your public professor lecture back in 2016. So, broadly, is this still an interest of yours and still something you're working on?
Yeah, it is certainly still an interest of mine. I've got this book coming out about archaeology and film coming soon, and it's, I think, especially now that we're stuck at home and we're consuming a lot of pop culture in different ways, right? Reading a lot of books, right? Watching a lot of TV and movies, right? I think it's a perfect time to be thinking about these issues. A couple that I talk about in my public prof lecture. There's one is the Percy Jackson book series. So if you're a parent who's trying to get children to read right now instead of just watching screens, right, the Percy Jackson series is a great example that the kids tend to like. And I sort of talk about how archaeology is used in that and some of the maybe problematic assumptions that go on with it. And one of the things I highlight is the way the Percy Jackson series suggests that at any one time there's one kind of world leader in culture and intellectual thought. And the premise of the Percy Jackson books is that the Greek gods have moved to Washington because Washington, D.C. is now the center of world culture. And so these are great books, and people like reading this, and they buy into that premise really easily. But of course, it's embedding some really problematic 18th and 19th century thinking about the nature of progress and the nature of global relationships. So I think that's one example. Another one I talk about is Star Trek. And again, I'm a big Star Trek fan. I love Star Trek, but I talk about the Prime Directive. And the Prime Directive is this conceit in Star Trek where when you go to a planet, if they have a certain level of technology, then you can talk to them about your world. But if they don't have that level of technology, then you can't engage with them because they haven't reached that developmental stage. And that's really building on some really problematic 19th century views about the world and about the nature of progress and how technology defines where somebody is in their stage of development, right? And so it's a really kind of problematic issue, and it's presented in Star Trek as a kind of liberal idea that we're trying to not be colonialists, but it's also embedding its own kind of colonial argument about technology defining a culture's value, right? And I think that's kind of problematic. So, these are the kinds of things when you're watching how archaeology gets used in pop culture now. You see it gets used in all sorts of different ways, and very often the ancient world is used as a foil to talk about the future or the present, right? And so that's something you could watch as you're binging Netflix and watching endless streaming content, right? As our lives have developed into today.
So, Kevin, you mentioned Netflix, which I think is something we're all probably spending a little more time on than we should be these days. But it's interesting to think about sort of popular culture being digitally mediated in the way that it is so much more today than in recent times. So I'm curious, is that influencing the field of archaeology as a whole? Is the actual study of archaeology being influenced by this kind of digitization of our world?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Archaeology is a really social field. I mean, we do our work by going off in the field with big groups of people, right? So we're also working on finding all other different kinds of ways to connect with people. So one of the things that immediately appeared sort of naturally, organically with the pandemic was a number of networks for scholars trying to get access to resources when libraries aren't open or they don't have access to their offices. So we have this amazing network that appeared on Facebook of people just sharing resources. And there's thousands of us connected by it. And every morning you wake up and you look at the list of articles. And if you have one, you pass it on to people that didn't necessarily have access to it before. It's the kind of thing I'm privileged at the University of Lethbridge. We have a great library and we have access to resources, and they're still working for us to help get us these resources. But scholars that are in not have the same kind of privileges that I have right now, they don't have access to these resources. And so this is a good way for us to broaden our scholarly community. So I think that's one of the ways that's been really striking to me, how the digital mediated relationships are changing. It's also making us realize that we need to be rethinking our publishing of archaeological data and rethinking how we preserve the material culture. And it's becoming really apparent that the difficulty in getting access to books is just one problem in terms of the data. And so one of the things I've been working on with a number of people are trying to come up with new forms of digital publications and means of publishing our archaeological results online and in ways that everybody has access to, and that you don't have to buy a copy of the physical book or have that physical book. And one of the things about archaeological site reports is they're often really, really boring things to read. They're just often just lists and lists of tables, right? And so these tables would be much better if we just had them online and people could access the material and use them with Excel or use them with other kind of software they'd want to use them to interpret. So as we're kind of in this environment, it's kind of making us realize that we're on the right track with these digital publications, and we have to ramp up that kind of approach. I mean, it's not going to stop us from needing to go visit museums and visit archives. Anybody that's worked in an archive knows that even if you can't have a digital copy of the thing you're looking at, it's still good to be able to engage with the real thing and to look at the collection and work with the archivists that are in that place. And it's the same thing with artifacts in museums. So we'll still need this stuff. But on the other hand, having a robust digital publication process will mean just opens up the world of scholarship so much more. And so I think that's going to, I think this is maybe just speeding up that process to which we get there.
So Kevin, we've been talking a lot about the practice of archaeology and ancient studies. And of course, this all focuses on people and places from a long time ago. If we think about our own odd circumstances right now, what do we know about the kinds of public health challenges that we're experiencing right now in the ancient world? What do we know about how they dealt with plagues or pandemics? It seems like we know a lot about Black Death, but what about earlier times?
Yeah, we have lots of evidence for plagues in the ancient world, and I think that that evidence points to some of the things that we're concerned with today. I think most ancient studies, scholars and historians would say that we need to be worried about a second wave. We see second, third, and fourth waves in the plagues we have evidence for. So I think there's two examples that immediately strike that come to mind for me. In my public prof talk, I talk about a site called Ugarit in Syria, and they're under the control of the Hittites. And in the late Bronze Age, the Hittites experienced a really significant plague in their capital city. And we have a lot of texts that are preserved with prayers that the king wrote, probably not the king, but maybe a scribe, but wrote, asking the gods to help them out with the plague. And it's really interesting looking at these late Bronze Age approaches to dealing with the plague. The first thing is trying to look at how they understood what caused the plague. And they note that they got the plague because they captured some Egyptian prisoners in a war and brought them back, and these Egyptian prisoners were sick. And soon that sickness spread throughout the city. So that's sort of an interesting one. But they didn't actually see that as the root cause, because for them, the causality of that wasn't that they made the choice to capture those prisoners, but the gods must have been angry at them for some reason to have made those prisoners sick to make that the instrument of causing them to become ill. And so we have these really interesting texts where the one king is basically asking the gods, like, what did we do wrong? Was it because my father assassinated the previous king to become king? Was it because he broke a treaty? Was it because he desecrated some of the different temples, and maybe the gods aren't liking how we're treating them now? He goes on, one of my favorite prayer texts of his is he explains to the gods, look, if you keep killing us all off, there's not going to be anybody else to give you any offerings anymore. So stop killing us, and you'll still get all the offerings you need in the temple. He's kind of trying to bribe the gods that way. So it's a really kind of interesting attempt at grappling with this issue. And we know that that plague hung around the city for about 20 years, right? So it was one where they just weren't able to get it under control. And part of it's because of their sense of epidemiology and the ability to actually constrain and limit these kinds of things. There's another really important plague that happens in Athens in about 430 BCE. It was during the second Peloponnesian, or the second year of the Peloponnesian War, which was a war between the city-states of Athens and Sparta. And this is a plague that swept through the city. It probably came in through the port because Athens had a very, very limited supply chain. So anything that came into Athens had to come into this one port city that's about, a little ways outside of the city. And so it meant that the plague could spread in pretty easily and stayed within the city. So it's a really interesting issue. It's written about by Thucydides, and Pericles, leader of Athens, died from this plague. So it was a noteworthy thing. And so we have to take Thucydides' descriptions of the plague with a grain of salt. He talks about a kind of moral component to the plague, where people, once the plague hit, they just gave up on following laws or following social customs. They just did whatever they wanted to do and just gave up and just lived their lives thinking that they could be dead any moment from then. The response to that then was to impose very, very severe limitations on social behavior. And so it led to this other impact of really restricted social behavior. And we can see in Thucydides' account of this all sorts of things that we're grappling with right now. So we learn about the frontline, what we would call frontline healthcare workers becoming very, very sick with a plague easily, right? Because they're the ones dealing with the people that are getting sick, and the people of Athens trying to grapple with what do we do with these healthcare workers in relation to that sickness coming in. We see them trying to grapple with issues of supply chain, like we still need to get food into Athens, but if the food or that supply chain is what's bringing this plague in, how do we deal with that, and do we close off the city entirely? And we see after this plague winds down, and it comes back and forth again, there's 3 or 4 waves of this, we see a reconstruction of Athenian society where the disparity of wealth changes and the rights of foreigners are changed because of the extreme social changes that have happened with this. So there's a lot, I think, that we can get out of looking at the ancient world to see how these responses played out and what we can learn from them when we're thinking about our own issues today.
That's fascinating, Kevin. So beyond the specific question about the ancient response to plagues, which was really interesting to hear about, I'm wondering about some of the larger issues that you addressed in your public professor talk, which was about the archaeology of progress, decline, and collapse. What do you think an archaeological perspective on those kinds of issues or questions can offer us today?
Yeah, archaeology's contribution, I think, is that we have evidence that's based on a really long time scale. And I think that combination of things is really, really helpful in thinking through these kinds of issues. We can see how perspectives shift based on that time scale. So we're thinking about progress, decline, or collapse. One of the things we think about as archaeologists is were people aware of that collapse or change at the time that they were living? Or is it just that we can see that now because we can see a 100-year change of time in a way that they couldn't, right? So I think we're seeing right now with what we're experiencing, what felt like very, very, very quick transformations of our society, right? And so that's kind of interesting to think about when we think about long scale changes and whether that will continue to be a long scale change or whether things will kind of go back to normal, right? We don't know how that is now. I think some of the things that when we look at shifts and change over time archaeologically, we can see the real importance of resilience that's built into how society governs itself and how a society is organized. And this is something that Thomas Homer Dixon at the University of Toronto has been talking about a lot. He came and talked to the University of Lethbridge about this a few years ago. But it's a long-term issue that we're seeing in archaeology, right? Is that societies that can adapt and change have this resilience built into them that allow themselves to make changes when something like this happens. I think an interesting thing that archaeology can show us also is what kind of structures, maybe social, political, or what kind of mentalities maybe prevent or limit resilience, limit our ability to change. If we look at the ancient world, we might think of certain kinds of social, political, or religious ideas that stop change from being able to happen. I think in terms of our society now, we can think about what kind of issues stop us from being able to make positive change or be able to respond to the plague. And I had a really interesting couple of conversations with people. And at one point I was talking to my former dissertation supervisor, and he was talking about how if you compare our time right now to post-war period, the ability for hospitals to deal with issues of capacity is just so much different, hospitals and factories, right? We had that capacity built into the system, so we didn't have to worry about flattening a curve. We could just ramp up production right away. And so I think that's a really interesting point when we think about what we've been going through over the past few months. And then I was talking to one of my friends who's more into high finance, and he was talking about exactly the same thing. And we were kind of talking about how fiduciary responsibility is one of these kind of limiting mentalities in contemporary times, where this idea that business people are beholden to their shareholders, and that's the primary moral responsibility should be in terms of how we treat our shareholders. So that ends up being a limitation on how we can make positive changes or respond to stress. So I've been complaining about this and worrying like, well, we need government regulation to step in and be the thing that prevents fiduciary responsibility from running rampant, because a CEO has to first, by law, do what's best for their shareholders, which isn't necessarily the best thing for the society at large. So my friend from a finance perspective said that he thinks a different approach is necessary. And now we can show to shareholders that capacity is actually in shareholder interest, right? And that this is something that building in capacity means that we don't shut down the economy for so long, and keeping margins of capacity at and margins of efficiency so low is problematic for shareholders. And so he thinks that you could solve the problem that way. So, whatever the actual solutions to these problems are, I think is sort of an interesting way that archaeology and finance had combined in a kind of mutual conversation about these issues.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for taking the time to answer our 5 questions today. It's always a pleasure to talk with you about your work. This whole series, the Public Professor series, and our sort of virtual version of it that we're doing now is just such a great opportunity to get a glimpse of the varied and fascinating work that so many of our talented faculty members at the U of L do every day. So thank all of you for joining us. As I said at the beginning, all of us at the U of L and in the Faculty of Arts and Science are missing our opportunity to connect with you, our community. And we're all looking forward to the days ahead when we can get together in person again and tell you about all the exciting work that's happening at the U of L. So everyone stay safe, stay healthy, and take care of each other. Thanks.